Good morning, everyone. It's time for the EasyPower Refresher Tuesday session. This is Jim Chastain. I'm with the support group here at EasyPower. I welcome all to the discussion. A basic tenet of the EasyPower software is to assist the users with regulatory requirement compliance. And so the topic today is a relatively simple question, that is, what happened to the HRC Category 0, but it kind of begs for a discussion of an evolution of some of these regulatory requirements. So that's what we're going to be spending some time on today. Hopefully we'll, by the time we're done, you will have a satisfactory answer to the question and in part a better understanding of what the situation is with nfpa 70E compliance. Now, before we jump into this, I wanted to kind of launch my first poll here, and it's something that comes up a lot, and that is, okay, if your facility has up labels, does that mean you're compliant, and vice versa? And at the same time, as I'm talking to contractors and consultants, it's surprising how often they are familiar with facilities that not only are not compliant, but don't have any pretext, and consequently don't even know about the labels or the need for the labels. So I just wanted to kind of throw this out there and get some feedback. And essentially, here's what folks are kind of sharing with me. So I appreciate the feedback. So when nfpa 70E has a basic 3-year renewal cycle or update cycle, and when the changes that came into effect with 2015 were announced, there were some early alerts or early internet articles on what the changes meant. And in reading some of these, they were confusing, at least to me, and in some cases they were wrong, or at least misguided in the way they were advising people regarding the changes that were coming. Interestingly enough, the information that was made, I guess, a regulation or put into effect with 2015 were actually in the version of 2012, and in some of the index and informational appendices, and so it wasn't necessarily a surprise, and I'll kind of get into that as we get farther into this. But the whole question and the changes that were involved with the HRC categories surprised some companies and concerned some companies, because their report was, well, our whole safety manual is built around these categories, and now they're changing them. So what's the deal? Why can we still get along with our safety manual, or does everything have to be redone? So what I plan to do is walk through the logic and try to explain, or at least offer some alternatives as far as choices people have when kind of dealing with this. So one of the first things that's obvious is with 2012, it was still okay to utilize what's referred to as a hazard risk category. And so this chart was part of 2012, and actually prior to that, it was actually, sorry about that, it was actually issued in 2004. But what this indicated for these 5 different categories, the band of incident energy, and then the level of clothing required, the ARC rating, and the type of material that had to be included. And what does this mean? So let me kind of take a second to run into that. In 2012, this table specifically meant Category 0 referred to anything less than 1.2 calories per square centimeter, and the PPE required to satisfy that requirement had to meet a 1.2 calorie per square centimeter rating. If the incident energy fell into the range of 1.2 to 4.0, if you were going to be within inside that arc flash boundary, then you had to suit to Category 1, which meant it had to meet a minimum level of 4 calories per square centimeter. Likewise, each of the succeeding ranges, if we were in a range where we measured our we calculated our incident energy to be between 8 and 25, we had to suit to 25, even though we were only a tad over 8. And the downside, at least at that time, was that we were oversuiting, and the reason for that obviously was to be conservative, but this is a fairly wide range of incident energy, and it did kind of come out as cross purposes between trying to meet a level of safety and in some cases making the job more difficult, because this type of a suit, or even more so when you get up into the higher range of something that had to be rated for 4 calories, was very cumbersome, made the work more difficult, reducing the dexterity, very hot, and in some cases making a dangerous situation even more so, because it reduced visibility and it limited what people could actually do with the equipment on. So the feedback was it was onerous, and it made things more difficult. With the advent of NFPA 70E 2015, there are basically 2 ways, and frankly there have been 2 ways to determine PPE category, but now specifically talking about what's in 2015, there are the arc flash hazard PPE category tables, and here they're not talking about HRC, they're talking about PPE category tables, which we'll expand upon in a second. That's one method to determine PPE. The second method is to calculate incident energy. Now you recall on the previous slide, we were combining these two and using incident energy to look up the PPE category table, and we called that the HRC table. Well, here we have a separation of those 2 items. So when we talk about the table method in 2015 of determining the PPE required for arc flash safety, the descriptions start off with a series of tables that as you walk through, they will give you a go, no-go on whether or not a PPE is required. And then as you get into more details where it is required, they give us a series of questions on how to determine that. But this is significant in that, at least in this first category, they are telling us quite specifically where we don't have to put on PPE. And in fact, this first case is one in point. During the normal operation of a circuit breaker, switch, or contactor, if we can answer all of these 5 questions positively, then we don't need to put on PPE. And these are very important questions. 1, is the equipment properly installed? Is the equipment properly maintained? All the equipment doors are closed and secured. All the covers are in place and secured. And then a big one, there is no evidence of impending failure. If all those can be answered to the affirmative, and all we're doing is operating a circuit breaker or contactor or a motor starter, then it's not required to put on PPE. Again, we go through this table and look at each of the tasks that may be involved in any particular activity, and as the tasks become more complicated, or as the covers are removed and we can't answer the affirmative on these 5 questions, then we are directed to determine what PPE is required. To get there, we need to know the voltage level on the bus that's going to be exposed, the short circuit current, and then the clearing time. And based upon those 3 factors, we can use this chart, this table, to look up the PPE category to use for the operation that we've decided to undertake. Now the same thing applies where, and you'll notice here, at no point in time are they talking about incident energy. So that's probably the first big clue right there. All right, and then this takes us all the way down to a description of what each of these categories are and what's required between Category 1 and Category 3. So as we're kind of looking forward to answering the original question, we can see this. There's a number of things that have changed. It's not quite as simple as what happened to Category 0. For instance, there is no HRC category to start with. In fact, there's no HRC table. This is a PPE category. All right. So I'd like to reiterate the fact that these assumptions are overriding in any case, and that is all the calculations that we're doing, all the estimates as far as PPE are based upon the fact that things have been installed properly and we understand or verify that they are. They've been maintained properly. There's no signs of malfunction. All the covers are on and the doors are closed and secured. Not always easy to verify, and there are times we may be walking into a situation where that doesn't apply, in which case we again have to go to the worst case or the most conservative approach in terms of donning PPE equipment. Now, on the other hand, the second method for determining PPE under 2015 and frankly even under 2012, but now it's been specified directly, that is to calculate incident energy. And what do we do when we calculate incident energy? Well, we were allowed before to cross-connect, cross-pollinate incident energy calculation and the lookup table. Now, we can't, and I'll show you where it specifies that in nfpa 70E. What this table allows us to do now is once we've calculated incident energy and we know specifically what it is, if we're below 1.2, then again we suit to 1.2. Now, if you recall, this was Category 0 before, so I guess I'm at the end of the day, I'm going to argue it really hasn't gone anywhere. It has basically a different condition to getting there, and we're calling it something different. When we get to Category 1.2 to 12 calories, now we have a description of what the PPE needs to be. The big difference here, though, is we can actually suit up to the ARC rating that we've calculated. So whatever we determine to be the worst case incident energy, we can actually suit up and layer up. And in the case of 1.2 to 12, we may be able to do it with a single layer. As we get to the higher levels, greater than 12 calories, then it may take multiple layers to get there, but we can still suit up just to that determined incident energy level. So you can see this ends up being much more, I don't want to say flexible, much more deterministic in terms of we know the danger, we've calculated the worst case danger, now we protect our people to that point, and they have the most optimum working condition in terms of both being safe and not overburdening them with extra equipment that they don't necessarily need. Now here's the point where it all comes together in the standard itself. So we're referring to Table H3B, and that's the guidance on the selection of ARC-rated clothing or other PPE when we have calculated incident energy. There's 3 ranges, and we're able to calculate and suit up to that specific incident energy that we've predicted. You'll notice that there are no categories indicated, but the focus is on the material and people understanding that some parts of the body may be farther or closer to the ARC source in a worst case situation, and it's encouraged that even though we have maybe a minimal level of suiting, that if we have body parts that are inside that distance, that they may, based upon the assessment of the worker, frankly, and the manager involved, require additional protection. We'll notice also that we can, as I probably have said it 3 times now, we can suit up to the ARC-rated incident energy. Frankly, I read this as a focus on the workers understanding the the hazard involved. And while it may have been easy to say, okay, well, I was just this category 3 or category 2 and I walk off and mindlessly put something on, there really is, I think, an encouragement, a push to better training of people involved, that there really is a danger, a significant danger, and we need to be involved. We as workers, with qualified workers, need to understand that we have a responsibility, and not only correctly choosing the PPE, but making sure that we're using it and we're aware of these 5 assumptions that are being made. Because as I walk up to the panel and it's been installed, it's been maintained, everything's secure, or we've opened up whatever we've opened up, I have on the proper PPE, if I hear vibration noises, or if I see sparks, or if I see standing water, now all bets are off. I can't assume that there's no potential for malfunction, and frankly, I need to go back and talk to my manager. It's like, hey, there's something else going on. Maybe we need to do this particular task or this particular function in a de-energized mode, because the calculations we've just gone through don't necessarily apply. All right, now so this is the gotcha, if you will, in 2015E, when we start talking about not only how this is done, but how it applies to the labels. And that is the arc-rated clothing and equipment with an arc rated equal to or greater than the determined incident energy. Again, this is for where we've calculated the worst case incident energy. The arc ratings can be for a single layer or for a multi-layer system. Again, we can, and it's incumbent upon the worker and the manager to appreciate the fact that we may have an elevated hazard level, and consequently we can put on layers that have been tested and recommended to meet that level of energy. Now when we get to the label, this is straight out of NFPA 70E Article 130.5. This is what it talks about, the requirements on displayed on the label. We want to have the nominal system voltage, the arc flash boundary, the shock boundaries, but at least one of the following: the available incident energy and corresponding working distance, or the PPE category from the tables that we looked at a little bit earlier. But we can't have both. So if we have incident energy, we can't refer to an arc flash PPE category at the same time. So I think this is a significant difference on the label, and we're allowed to put the minimum arc rating of the clothing. One other caveat that is in this particular paragraph or article is the fact that we can determine, a manufacturer can determine a site-specific level of PPE and reference that with the incident energy levels that have been determined for that particular bus. So we've had questions when we do these discussions online about, well, all I need to do now is say, okay, the PPE category is category 1 or category 2, but in fact that's not allowed per this regulation, this particular article. If we're going to have incident energy and working distance, then we cannot put on the PPE category as referenced by these particular tables. Now, the way I read this is that my safety manual can determine specific site level categories if I define what those categories are, and I spell out what the PPE is for category 1 and category 2 and category 3, and that's, I tell the worker that based upon this incident energy, you go to this category level as determined by company XYZ. Now, that's one way to work with this. It's not the only way to deal with it, but it does emphasize, I guess, my underlying point, and that is the migration that I see in NFPA 70E is to emphasize more and more things like maintenance and worker training, and somewhat at least put them on the same footing as we've been talking about incident energy calculations. It's good and it's important to understand the energy that's contained in the bus, but it's equally good and important to understand that the maintenance of the maintenance of the facility and the piece of equipment are equally as important and have as much to do with the potential for a catastrophic event as putting on a set of gear or set of specific clothing. Don't mean to beat that one into the ground. So I'm gonna do another poll here. Let's see if I can get this up online. And that is, when you do see labels on the facilities that you work with, are the instructions clear? Does it seem to you that they clearly spell out what's required for that piece of equipment, and the workers that observe these are adequately forewarned or adequately informed? So the consensus, at least here, is we're more than 60% in the affirmative. And I just appreciate some feedback. So back to the initial question. What happened to HRC 0, Category 0? Well, first of all, HRC as a reference or as a table or even as a list of categories no longer exists. You'll see in all the table labels and all the instruction that they refer to these as arc flash PPE categories. So it's not so much that it's a trick question. HRC as a categories table no longer exists. There is no PPE Category 0, and I think that's evident of the fact that if it's less than 1.2 calories per square centimeter, that doesn't mean there's no arc flash danger there. It just means the level of protection can be relatively low. And if I'm working, even if the arc flash boundary is 9 inches, and I have my face or I have my hands within that space, then I better have some protection on them. And so consequently, it's important to understand that and not ignore the fact, because we used a reference to some sort of 0 that implied there was not much going on. So when we get to the bottom line, if there's more than 50 buses on exposed conductors that humans can come in the vicinity, then they need to have a label on it. If during normal operation the equipment needs to be maintained, inspected, or otherwise opened up so that there's bare conductors exposed to humans, it needs to have a label on it. If the voltage is greater than 208 and it's fed by a transformer with greater than 125 kVA, there should be a concern about arc flash. Incident energy is below 1.2 calories. Even if they have just a few inches of arc flash boundary, we need to be aware of the protection involved. And I think it emphasizes the fact that operators must be trained to understand the need for arc flash PPE. And when we're showing on a label the incident energy and working distance that we have discussed on a routine basis, frankly, in a safety meeting type of environment, the importance of understanding what PPE level, how to layer up if it's an elevated category, but what PPE needs to be utilized. And again, this to me is less of a label issue and it's more of a training issue. And I think if we have a training system that encompasses this and tells the workers, the employees, that okay, the NFPA requirement has changed, this label currently indicates such and such, and I want you to know when you see this level of incident energy calculated, here's what we're going to use for PPE. It may take me a month, it may take me 3 months to change all the labels, but if you have any questions, let's sit down and talk about what the PPE level that's required, because it may be different than what's on the label. Okay, so without beating that more up, let me see if I can kind of get some feedback on this. Having gone through this discussion, do you think the regulations will help or hurt? And again, this is informal, and it's basically talking between us. Frankly, I've seen, even in my own reaction in discussing this with several different audiences, is that there is a fair amount of logic behind this. When you start putting out dictates in a regulation and there's any kind of resistance to it, I think moving towards more of a training mode or an education mode rather than coming down and hard on more restrictive regulations, you'll get better results. And as loath as I am to suggest that there's logic behind the way a government regulation is traveling, I think that's what's going on here, is that the IEEE, NFPA, and the OSHA folks are seeing that there's still a lack of compliance with the NFPA regulations, and that there's some need to help industry not only deal with the fact that these are cumbersome, they are restrictive, but people are still getting killed because they're not taking care of themselves in an arc flash environment. I wanted to make sure that you had at least knowledge of the fact that we have several other tutorials on the website. We have the ability to download the tools for calculating these incident energies. We have other websites. In fact, starting next week, we have a 4-week series in this same time slot where we're doing a overview of NFPA 70E compliance, specifically dealing with 2015, and that includes starting from scratch and how to deal with either conducting or managing an arc flash hazard assessment. Appreciate everyone attending, and likewise, please join us next week. Next week starts a series of 4 one-hour sessions. It's basically the half-day workshop that we do as we travel around the country. And if you miss this one or you miss some of those in the future, these are going to be on the website as far as pre-recorded sessions.